In this lesson, I want to talk more about servers and ports so we can have a better understanding of what happens exactly when we run a command like npm start like we did in the previous lesson. So first up, what is a server? A server is a continuously running program on your computer. So if you have something like a plain JavaScript file and you write some code in there like a console log, when we run that file with Node, Node will process that file, run through the code, and then when execution completes, the file is done running and the program ends, right? And that's kind of a different idea from a server, which is still fundamentally a program in a programming language like JavaScript. It's just continuously running until we tell it to stop. And the reason it needs to be continuously running is because the logic in it needs to be executing all the time. So for example, in our project, npm run start starts a server that serves an HTML page in our browser with the React application. And more importantly than that, when we update the code, the server sees our changes, it recognizes them, it's listening for them, so it sees the changes and it retranspiles the code so we see the latest changes in our browser. And we need a server because we need that process to always be running, to always be listening to changes in our code so that it can react and render those changes in the browser. So that server is basically just a program that is listening and running all the time until we shut it down. And of course, the reason we do that is so that it's really convenient for us to develop. Imagine that we had to make our changes in VS Code, then rerun a command to see the changes in the browser. That would work, of course, but it wouldn't be as convenient and as quick. So instead, the Create React team and the Webpack team says, well, why don't we have this JavaScript server run all the time that's tracking it and reacting it, right? Reacting to it, to our changes. So that's kind of the benefit of it. So when we're talking about the term server, you'll often hear a complementary term, which is client. The client is the program that talks to the server and makes requests to it. So in our situation, we can call our client the web browser. The web browser is the entity that is making a request to the React server, or alternatively, we can call it the Webpack server, and that server is delivering it the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. All right, so you'll often hear the terms server and client, and what a server is and what a client is may vary depending on the context in which it's being used. In our scenario, the server is the Webpack React server, and our client is the web browser that is getting things from it, right? That brings us to another question, which is what is a port? Well, a server, which is just a program on our computer, runs on a port. And you can think of a port like an available slot on your computer. A good analogy that I can make is either ports in a shipyard or spaces in a parking lot. So if you look at that image on the right, you can see all of those various parking spaces, and you can think of that yellow car as our React application. It needs an open slot that it can occupy that's not going to conflict with any other program running on any other port, and that's where it's going to run. All right. So you can think of our Create React app or our React app running on port 3000 as that specific open space in the parking lot. So multiple servers, or in other words, multiple programs that are continuously running, can run on our computer at the same time. That's kind of a beautiful thing because we can run, for example, our React server, we can run a backend server, we can run a database server, and they can all run on the same computer, but we need to give them each an independent slot in which to run so they don't conflict with each other, right? If React, for example, is going to be on port 3000, we can't have our database also run on port 3000. Otherwise, we have two cars, right, trying to occupy the same parking spot, or equivalently, two programs or servers trying to run in the same place, the same slot. So each server we run must run on a different port on our computer. Each port is just an available slot. Right? So when we loaded the React app in our browser, we saw in the URL bar that we didn't have a website like www.amazon.com. Rather, we saw localhost :3000. So what does that mean? The term localhost simply refers to our own computer. So the computer that you are writing your code on, from its reference, from its perspective, localhost is itself. And then the number we see after the colon is the port number on which that server is running. So Create React app by default is going to run the React server at port 3000. So what we're seeing in localhost 3000 literally means our computer at port 3000. Now that port number of 3000 is totally arbitrary. It can be whatever we want. It's just the number that the React team has chosen. And usually you're going to see numbers like this because it's easier to memorize 3000 than it is to memorize a number like 4592. But 4592 is still a totally valid port number. It just so happens that 3000 is the arbitrary number that the React team has chosen. Now, going back to what we talked about in the previous lesson, we cannot run multiple servers on the same port because it's a designated spot for that server and that program to be continuously running. So one common issue you'll see if you accidentally try to run npm start in a React project in, let's say, a separate tab when another tab is already running that React project, is you might see an error like this. And if you take a second to read the message, it's actually pretty self-explanatory. It says something is already running on port 3000, and at the very bottom it's going to ask, would you like to run the React app on another port instead? So Create React App can recognize if a port is occupied, such as 3000, and try to run your React application on another port. All of that is just to prove that that number of 3000 is arbitrary. The only reason I wanted to bring this message up is it's going to be very common that you're going to see this message, especially when you're starting out, because you might forget that you already have the React server running in one terminal window. And whenever you're trying to do something in another terminal window or tab, you might accidentally run npm start again and get an error message like this. Remember, we need that terminal window or tab to stay open so that it is running that React server. It's a continuous process that is going to be in that tab, right? Which means we have to do other code in other terminal tabs or windows, right? And so we can't just close that tab because that will terminate the process, which will terminate the server and thus not get anything to work in our browser. So again, this message will appear if you already are running a React application on port 3000 and you try to run npm start in either the same React project or another React project, which will try to launch on the same port of 3000 and then say, hey, wait a minute, this is already taken. Can I run this app on another port if you let me? All right, so just a heads up, because this is a very common issue that a lot of beginners run into. It's just a common user error. All right, so now that we have a better understanding of servers and ports, we can get back to the code and start talking more about the files that Create React App has generated for us. So I will see you in the next lesson.